The massive palace shakes with the clash of swords. A woman sits there praying non-stop. Recap manhwa. She begs the all-knowing and generous one to hold her without any pain and finally let her leave this world. Adele Lancaster wanted to keep her faith in divine providence and endure, but the doors were already open. The pain, though fleeting like a light breeze, left its mark on her soul. However, the fruits of patience were truly sweet. The knights were ordered to find her. Only one room remained. As soon as they broke down the door, the protagonist saw a crowd of knights led by a man in a red cloak. She, however, calmly waited, sitting in the center of the room. There was no trace of fear on her face. The knights smirked maliciously. The rumors weren't lying, and that woman was really beautiful despite the chaos, still acting like a duchess. The man in the red cloak addressed the duchess. Adele Lancaster had dark hair and a fine beard on his face. With a calm, emotionless voice, Adele asked if he was going to execute her right there, but by imperial order the count had to capture her alive. The protagonist wondered when everything had gone wrong, sitting on that old worn chair and confessing her guilt. She reflected on the honor and dignity of a noble. Adele endured all this nonsense after nonsense, but she couldn't even die as she wished. The flawless Lady Edith Lancaster, admired by everyone 3 years ago, briefly became the Duchess of Lancaster initially. The ladies found this engagement disgusting. The Lancasters were one of the 4 influential families, but marrying such an old duke was just horrifying, and the aristocrats constantly gossiped about it among themselves. But Adele stayed unshaken. Many couldn't figure out what she was thinking. In the empire, there are 4 families with immense power, and Adele was educated and prepared from a young age to join one of them in marriage. Now she had finally fulfilled her destiny. Who could have imagined Adele would end up being the tool to unite 2 families? But because of the duke's treacherous plan, she became the wife of a traitor. And now the emperor was happy to have finally gotten the main trophy of this war. The duke's second wife was now in his hands. The heroine had been raised her whole life with a single purpose. Adele collapsed where she was because she was so scared to run that she couldn't bear the thought of dying on the floor. That's why she dragged an old chair to sit down. The aristocrats immediately started asking the king to hand over the traitor to them. They offered to forgive the old widower and decide the prisoner's fate. Through a duel so someone could claim this beauty. Looks like no one here kept their dignity. Now Adele Lincoln was just a slave. The great Emperor Marcus Tuberin raised a crystal glass of expensive red wine and let out a joyful laugh. He almost forgot the protagonist who crushed the rebellion. The ruler asked Laszlo if he needed that woman. If Count Croesus wanted her, the emperor could give her, but his face stayed serious. Lady Adele married the wrong man and now had fallen. People didn't understand why the emperor wanted to give that main war trophy to a commoner. As far as the protagonist remembered, the count had been a mercenary in the past, but now he was no different from any other knight. Laszlo Croesus was the head of the empire's largest mercenary guild. He was a man who, at just 27 years old, became a count through military merits in the great empire. To the aristocrats by birth, Laszlo was the biggest threat. Among the new nobility on the emperor's side, he was considered the most dangerous, but the nobles who saw mercenaries as scum looked at him with disdain and treated him like a commoner. Now Laszlo looked at the prisoner with severity. The protagonist looked away. The count informed his majesty he wasn't sure about the proposal. Adele's eyes widened in shock and confusion when he indifferently added that he also lacked servants on his property. The emperor burst out laughing upon hearing that Laszlo wanted to turn the ex-duchess into a servant, but the count had no other use for her. Marcus Tuberin made that decision. In front of everyone present, Adele Lancaster was granted to Count Laszlo Croesus, who needed servants. Was this the reward for her patience? Back in the day, Adele's mom told her to stop talking back to her dad, but the girl wasn't about to marry some dude older than her pops. Still, her mom made it clear there was no better match since this guy already had a side chick and grown-up heirs. After he died, Adele could score a fat inheritance, but the daughter didn't get any of it at all. Becoming a duchess of one of the most powerful families in this empire, she'd get so much clout even her own dad would have to bow down to her. The protagonist's eyes went wide as hell. She begged her dad to listen, but the dude saw it as a total disgrace. Because his daughter didn't want to grind for the fam that had already been through so much. That's why the count did so much for someone as useless as her. Tears welled up in Adele's eyes. This was her shot to ditch her dad and bounce from the Canyon Count's house for good. That one thought was what kept Adele going, but she often had to deal with shade and harsh words behind her back. She was put in charge of dozens of records and 100 servants. But Adele kept pushing through, greeting guests daily and throwing long events. She endured it all but never slipped up, playing her part with a smile. This was all for that moment of freedom she hoped would come, until one day the butler burst into her room and told her to run. That's when Adele found out the imperial army was rolling in. Now she knew the secret plan had failed. The protagonist sprinted down a huge empty hallway, not seeing a single palace servant anywhere. Then Adele realized she was just bait to stall the knights. She wanted a life totally different, one full of warmth and human kindness. But no matter what Adele did for that nobleman, only the butler told her to flee. Just like her dad wanted, she became a flawless lady. Maybe all that pain was some divine sign. Though they called her a trophy, she basically became a regular slave, even though the empire had abolished that ages ago. The Duke of Lancaster's daughters were pissed she kept building something so noble. Larina, the Count's eldest, hated that influential figure deeply. Daria Lancaster, the second daughter, yelled that it had been like that from the start. They were convinced their dad's ex-wife was secretly helping the Canyon Count. Edel had no choice but to stay quiet and take it all. The girl called her an ungrateful creature. Hearing trash talk wasn't new, but never had it been this rude coming from the Duke's daughters. It seemed like they'd just run out of patience and decided to give up. Edel wasn't about to waste her energy on dumb arguments. She knew the moment would come when the watch would slack off, so the protagonist had to save her strength, at least to die on her own terms. Better to die than live as a toy. The Count Crisis said he'd take her as a servant, but the young prisoner doubted she'd get any humane treatment from those stronger than her. Even though Edel was a prisoner, they put her in a decent cell. Still, her whole body screamed in pain and her head throbbed. The protagonist decided to take a nap, hoping some good ideas would hit her after resting. She had to figure out how to end her life. Night passed, and finally over the castle, with its tall towers and fortified walls, the sun began to rise again. Edel slowly opened her eyes and sat up. Despite the fatigue, she woke up at her usual time. According to imperial orders, the protagonist was to be handed over to Croesus's hawk, so she urgently needed to find a way to die. That meant this was Edel's last morning alive. The sky blue lights streaming through the prison windows seemed to say goodbye, filling the stone cell with a soft glow. Today the sky looked beautiful. The last meal was fancy for a criminal. As soon as the Duke's daughters were ordered out of the prison, the protagonist prayed they'd be okay. Then the guard let Edel out. They were ordered out of the prison, and the protagonist prayed they'd be okay. Then the guard let Edel out. Even though she was dying, she kept her dignity as she stepped outside where the sun's rays bathed the earth in light. The protagonist immediately decided to jump straight off the carriage. That could work perfectly if she got lucky. Death would be instant, she hoped. She fervently wished to be assigned an inexperienced servant so she could pull it off, but all her hopes vanished when Edel saw the Count and now fully realized her total helplessness. The carriage, decked out with intricate designs and shiny metal details, sped down the road. Laszlo, arms crossed, stared out the window. The protagonist didn't expect this guy to show up in person. She figured the Count would just want to follow her and maybe even try to talk to her. The woman was sure he clearly didn't like her. Suddenly the Count unfastened his red cape and handed it to the protagonist. She had no clue why he'd do that, so Laszlo told her to stop shaking. Edel didn't even notice as she grabbed the cape and thought, if I throw this coat, maybe I can buy time to jump off the moving carriage. Then it would all be over, crushed under the wheels of the passing carriage. She could already hear it coming. Counting to 3, the woman decided to open the door and jump slowly, counting down in her head, but the Count coldly said not to even think about it. Edel was shook. This guy knew everything, which is why he got on the same carriage with her, and now the protagonist was sure he wouldn't leave her alone. Near evening they arrived at the place. Laszlo was the first to step out of the carriage. The protagonist looked at the place that would be her new hell, where she'd have to live from now on. The Count watched her, waiting for her to come out. Taking a step, Edel immediately felt pain in her ankle. Losing balance, the young woman started to fall, with nothing to grab onto, but the crash never came. Edel was slow to realize she was now in the man's arms. Laszlo caught her, something the protagonist totally didn't expect. So now she was confused, her eyes shot open. She'd been raised to always act like a proper lady, and falling into someone's arms was a no-go. She pulled away immediately, hoping the Count wouldn't misread her reaction and apologize for her behavior. Laszlo pulled his hand back right away. Heading to the manor, he ordered them to follow. Laszlo went inside and immediately asked the housekeeper if everything was in order during his long absence. A female voice answered right away. The housekeeper said the estate was in safe hands and there was nothing to worry about. Edel was surprised there wasn't a butler. The Count remembered the woman was missing maids, so he brought reinforcements and asked to assign her somewhere. First thing, she needed to bathe and rest in the assigned room. And tomorrow she could start working. Edel was surprised he hadn't ordered her to share his bed. Instead, he really brought her like a servant named Mina. Mina immediately ran to Mrs. Bogdan and told her she'd found out something about the knights. Turns out that woman was the fallen Duchess of Lancaster. The head maid's eyes went wide. Who would have thought they'd have a real duchess under their command? Now Mrs. Bogdan immediately told Mina to take that woman to the farthest room. Meanwhile, the head maid decided to figure out where to assign that pretty girl for now. It was pretty kind of them to bring Edel food and even spare clothes. Now the protagonist was stuck living in a tiny room. The situation said it all. She was no longer an aristocrat. Edel felt cold and suspected they simply didn't have hot water there. She'd have to bathe in cold water, even during the harshest winters. It was weird because the Count's finances shouldn't be that bad. But Edel decided not to ask questions. Now the best thing was to focus on her new life. It was surprising, and even kinda ironic, that in such a tough situation Edel actually felt hungry. It was delicious since Edel never expected to taste fruit again. Edel just wanted to die. But Edel decided not to question it. Now the best thing was to focus on her new life. It was wild, even kinda ironic that in such a tough spot Edel actually felt hungry. It was delicious since Edel never expected to taste fruit again. She just wanted to die, because she didn't want to become a toy for some dirty desires. Maybe she'd get lucky and the cone of crisis wouldn't touch her. Edel just wanted to live in peace and enjoy the sweetness of fruit, but that was totally impossible. To know if she could really live a simple life as a housekeeper, but now Edel had to survive. Only then might she find peace in her soul. The counselor with a serious expression informed His Majesty that today, Count Cruz had brought the prisoner, but the Emperor didn't even hesitate. What he really wanted was to hear the opinion of Counselor Marco. Tuberville, who asked if Count Cruz seemed satisfied but the advisor confused, said he wasn't sure. Others didn't even suspect the true nature of the... They signed a contract with the Emperor to join the inner forces, although the solo ones only joined for the reward. Thanks to his mercenary army, he scored countless wins. Then the Emperor let him ask for whatever he wanted. However, he told him he only needed the reward specified in the contract. That bold, shameless attitude of the mercenary made him the perfect candidate to be the Emperor's loyal dog. But to tame a hound you need the perfect bait. A title wouldn't cut it. As soon as Laszlo became a count, all the aristocrats started whispering unhappy with His Majesty's decision. They didn't get their ruler's move. At that reception, Laszlo was the ignored main character, but the Emperor noticed that all night the Count's gaze was fixed on just one woman. No doubt to Lancaster the dice had been rolled, and now all that was left was to watch. Laszlo was furious, not understanding the Emperor's intentions at all, and honestly he didn't believe it would end up with him actually getting involved with that duchess. He accepted the title to marry off his sister to a good family, though. Laszlo suddenly became noble, but the disdain toward him both as a pleb and mercenary hadn't disappeared. The guy knew exactly how they'd treat him in the marriage market. After watching a bit, Laszlo realized the noble marriage market was just straight up disgusting, but Adel smiled even when she was sold off as a wife to a crazy old man not even putting up a fight. Maybe that woman was just greedy and sold her youth for power, but for some reason, Laszlo couldn't take his eyes off her. Still, they weren't meant to even exchange a single word because unlike him, Adel was born into an aristocratic family, yet now that same woman served in his house as a maid. Probably the Emperor's plan was a warning. If Laszlo hadn't accepted her, that woman definitely would have been sold or just offed herself. But Adel was left alone in the palace when everyone fled. Count Canyon simply cut the ties with his kids to save his own skin. In the end, the Duchess was abandoned by both the Duchess's family and the Count's, but it was too late to choose death. Laszlo didn't get why the aristocrats were desperately trying to save something at the cost of their own lives. Maybe if she stays here, they'll find a use for her. The next morning came, and the housekeeper threw the dirty clothes back into the bucket and asked the ex-Duchess with disdain if that's how they washed clothes in her house. Adele looked at her confused. She promised she'd do her best to improve. Madame Boyan strictly asked her subordinate Sally if she was properly training her new maid. It was necessary to strictly supervise Adele and teach her well. She was a traitor to the Lancaster house caught by the Count, so she was probably plotting something. But Sally wasn't sure if no problems would come up later. Then the housekeeper asked if she was really scared of the ghost of the dead Duke coming for his unlucky wife, then laughed and ordered everyone to get to work now. Adele understood what the housekeeper meant yesterday. Seems like she's trying to assert her authority by stepping on the old nobility from the previous main character in the mud. Lady Bojan acted like that from the moment the servants were introduced. Surely the housekeeper expected her to break down. As soon as the housekeeper left, Maid Sally sighed in relief, which caught Adele's attention. Sally thought this woman was totally crazy mentioning the dead. The main character found out this young woman was in charge of laundry and figured she felt super uncomfortable teaching Adele. Edith decided to finish the laundry before the housekeeper complained again. First, she had to deal with what was right in front of her. The main character could totally handle the teasing aimed at her. However, the problem was totally different. No one knew how much longer her body could hold up in the Canyon family mansion. A cup crashed to the floor and shattered. Count Canyon started yelling at his daughter, calling her a worthless, useless piece of trash. William asked his dad what to do now since Errol was basically the mercenaries' trophy, but the Count demanded they never mention that useless girl. First, he had to beg the king to believe that Duke Lancaster was threatening them, forcing them to help in a betrayal. The Duke was holding her against her will, and as a father the Count couldn't say no. The Emperor figured that in that case, Recap Manhwa, he wouldn't have objections about his daughter's fate if he insisted on her innocence. The Count immediately confirmed his words. If Adel was already married, it meant she no longer belonged to his family. Kneeling Dustin begged and handed over not just the duchy's secrets, but also half his fortune enduring the humiliation. Marco came from the Imperial to Baron House. He became emperor after his useless dad even pulling in commoners to strengthen his power, which means this dude was a straight-up snake willing to do anything. In the end, he turned that useless girl into a filthy mercenary's toy. The Emperor shamed the Canyon House to warn other nobles from the jump. His Majesty planned to use Big Dustin to humiliate the whole family. The Count ordered his kids to keep a low profile. But Dustin was ready to rise again. Edel stepped outside on a warm sunny day to hang the freshly washed clothes on the line, enjoying the light breeze when suddenly someone called her. The main character turned around when familiar voices suggested going together. It was Celia and Layla, which shocked the former Duchess deeply since she didn't expect that kind of warm treatment from anyone here. They were headed the same way, so the girls suggested going together. As a result, they hung all the clothes together. It had been 10 days since the main character crossed the threshold of this mansion, and since then her life had completely changed. Someone might ask what Adele was doing here. She was the flag and worked so hard she could proudly announce it. Thanks to that, the heroine had already gotten used to the clothes. There was just one problem, the head maid who complained for no reason and mocked the former lady. She was always unhappy with the clothes. One day Celia decided to defend Adele. She confidently said a result like that deserved praise for a newbie who had barely adapted to such a complicated task. That's why the laundry manager asked the housekeeper to handle her business. The maid tried to protest, but Celia cut her off immediately. All this time, Edel watched the argument with amazement and a bit of confusion, unable to say anything. Celia grabbed a dirty towel and suggested to the manager to try washing it. The woman ran off right away, but promised she'd do whatever it took to keep her in check. Edel asked Celia excitedly if that was okay. The girl explained she did it for everyone's good. Since the manager had been bugging everyone with her constant complaints, still the main character was grateful for her help. Celia promised that in a few days everything would be fixed. There was a lot of work in the laundry, so the woman in charge asked everyone present to keep going. A thought crossed Edel's mind: the maids constantly suffered because of her presence. She didn't even get a chance to talk to them or know what they thought, so Edel just hoped it wasn't too hard on them. Maybe the laundry girls just didn't have time to think about anything else. The work was so tough. All their hands were covered in calluses. During those 10 days, Count Croesus didn't look for Edel even once, like he'd completely forgotten about her at home. Luckily, the main character was allowed to live like a simple servant. She was thankful and happy to have escaped the Duke's home. Tomorrow she'd have to work hard again. So the main character didn't waste any more time and immediately got into bed. She wished the quiet nights would keep coming, and that the next day she'd get lucky and eat some unexpected apples. Edel heard footsteps approaching her door. It was late, and the young woman started fearing the Count had changed his mind. The footsteps suddenly stopped right outside her room door, making Edel. She froze in place and her heart pounded harder. She asked, scared, "Who's there?" A soft knock was heard at the door. The stranger introduced herself as Daisy, explaining she lived in the next room, and asked to come in to talk. That girl was the youngest maid in the palace. The protagonist let Daisy into the room, confused. Daisy quickly explained there was nothing special about her visit, and she just wanted to deliver something, a balm and cream for sore spots. Edith asked, confused, why she was giving it to her. The younger maid said she hears her moaning in pain every night. After a long, exhausting day of work, the walls here were thin and she lived next door. Also, Daisy overheard that lady. Beaujean mocked Edel, the maid clearly not used to the work, which made it super tough when everything constantly hurt. So Daisy just wanted to give her the medicine. In the world Edel came from, nothing was done without a reason. Daisy handed the medicine to the protagonist with a warm smile and held her hand for a moment, showing support. It's wild that such a young girl could care so much about others. Turns out pure and sincere looks exist in this world too. Edel shyly thanked Miss Daisy, and the girl immediately got surprised, exclaiming she could just call her by her first name. So the protagonist also allowed Daisy to call her by her first name. Daisy shyly asked if she could call her sister Edel. She clutched the gifted medicine to her chest, nodded, and a warm, genuine smile bloomed on her face. The younger maid offered to help rub ointment on her back and shoulders, and the protagonist nodded, puzzled. If Edel kept a diary, she'd write about her new friend today. The next day, as Sally said, Edel's breakfast was meager, and the laundry manager wasn't surprised at all. The soup portion was cut in half, but there was a bun. Although they did give her fruit because of Daisy's ointment made with natural ingredients that promised to ease the pain, her body discomfort eased a bit. Before, Edel was often starved for the sake of her figure, so this was still little. Meanwhile, the Count read the new letter carefully. With every new word, his expression grew more serious. Like he was sinking deep into thought, he ordered that she be taken immediately to the guest hall. The protagonist followed the butler. Edel was surprised by the unexpected summons, but kept telling herself there'd be people there and nothing bad would happen. The door opened slowly. Just this morning, the young woman had hoped the day would be good. The protagonist, internally distressed, entered the grand living room and immediately announced her arrival to the Count. She asked why she'd been called. The Count pointed to the seat in front of him and asked her to sit. Every time the protagonist was in Count Christus's presence, she felt an unbearable sense of dread. Edel didn't resist and instantly obeyed the Lord's request. Laszlo asked if she knew the Marquise, widow Barbara Celestine. This unexpected question upset the protagonist, since she was actually friends with the Marquise, but Edel didn't get why he suddenly brought it up. Laszlo squinted and asked again if they knew each other. The protagonist decided it wasn't wise to mention that friendship, so she told the Count they'd only had tea together a couple of times. The man guessed the tea must have been good, since such a proper lady had sent a desperate letter to a crazy mercenary. The protagonist asked excitedly and loudly if it really was the Marquise's letter, only then realizing she should have been more low-key. The Count's gaze sharpened. He handed the letter to the ex-duchess, and Edel, full of emotion, accepted it with trembling hands. In it, Barbara begged the Count not to push Miss Edel into deeper despair, since she knew nothing about her husband's plans. When the protagonist stopped being a duchess, many distanced themselves from her, but that was natural given the serious accusations. However, the Marquise, Barbara sincerely believed in her innocence and cared deeply, something the protagonist hadn't expected. Surprisingly, in that place, Edel received kindness. Now she was comforted by an old friend. The main girl felt real relief from her close friend, and that's why she could barely hold back her emotions. But it wasn't clear what Count Crucius would think. He might believe Barbara was backing the Duke and the anti-Empire crew. Edel calmly explained to the Count that there were no ties between their families and that their friendship was purely personal. So she asked him not to misread the letter. Laszlo figured everyone already saw him as a monster. The main girl realized in horror that her reckless words had hurt the Count, and scared she apologized. Laszlo looked at her closely. The Count said she was shaking like she was about to chop someone's head off right then and there when she realized what she said. The man understood he shouldn't have said those things in front of her. The main girl, wide-eyed with surprise, stared at him closely. She'd never seen the Count with that kind of expression before. Edel couldn't believe he was feeling guilty right then. Laszlo knew that to her he was just the guy who caught and beheaded the Duke's first daughter, the fugitive from Lancaster. Maybe she thought he was a cruel monster. The Count didn't get how he could have said something like that. He just wanted to know why the Marchioness, Widow Celestine, needed him, but instead he came off way too rude. Laszlo had no clue what he was thinking at that moment. The main girl reread the letter, then calmly said the Count shouldn't worry since he'd faithfully followed His Majesty's orders and won the battle. But Laszlo couldn't understand how she could talk so calmly about it. There wasn't a trace of hate in the former Duchess. On the contrary, her eyes still shone bright with hope and faith in a better future despite all life's hardships and tests. Miss Edel really deserved the title of Duchess. Meanwhile, he only had the title of Count. That beautiful, cultured woman was nothing like him. He hadn't changed at all since then. Laszlo concluded he felt embarrassed now. He suggested the young lady write the reply herself, because no one would buy his excuses anyway. The main girl flashed a happy smile. Laszlo froze for a few seconds, but then added she should also include that he wouldn't treat her like society expected. Edel looked confused. She didn't know what to say, so she just thanked him. Laszlo was pissed about the rumors in society since he wasn't capable of that kind of nastiness. Having a little sister made him too soft for someone who hadn't even held a woman's hand before. Edel was fragile like a wounded bird. Even though she tried to look strong, she wasn't. This woman freaked out just from the touch of a regular mercenary, so Laszlo promised himself he'd never hurt her. Edel pressed the letter to her heart and thanked him sincerely once again, not even realizing how shocked the Count was now. Returning to the room with Daisy, who was shivering from the cold water, Edel said they'd worked hard today. Seems like this mansion never had hot water. Near the door, the girls said their goodbyes. When she entered, the main girl immediately noticed a pencil and paper on her desk and was even a bit surprised. So those words were real. When Edel asked for paper and a pen, the Count begged her not to hesitate to ask for stuff like that. The main girl immediately ran to the table and, smiling happily, started thinking about where to begin. But they'd probably read the letter, so she couldn't write like before. Placing a candle next to her, Edel took the pen in her hand, still remembering how they met 7 years ago at the tea party, hosted by Countess Radric, when all the ladies were shocked by the arrival of the Duchess, Widow Celestine. Edel was intrigued and asked what was up with the Marchioness showing up. Turns out the Countess and the Marchioness didn't get along? The main girl asked, surprised why she was invited, but before she could answer, the arrival of the Duchess, Widow Celestine, was announced. Then Edel saw her for the first time. The woman paused for a moment, like sizing up the situation, and looked at everyone with a piercing gaze. Before Edel hadn't heard the sound of heels. The Marchioness limped on one leg and probably used a prosthetic. The main girl was horrified because in that hall, footsteps sounded way louder than usual. So they invited her without knowing their relationship. It wasn't right to take advantage of her weaknesses. Edel ran straight to the Marchioness and whipped up a story on the spot, like the lady had once helped her in the city, with a broken wheel on her carriage, but the Marchioness brushed off her thanks and walked away without another word. Barbara looked at the young lady surprised. One of the ladies said the Marchioness's generosity was super noble and admirable. Edith was hoping this scene looked natural. She wanted her over-the-top enthusiasm to cover up the awkward noise and silence. The Marchioness grabbed the young lady by the shoulders, with a warm smile and a playful tone in her voice, calling her insistently with affection in her youth. Edel was proud to have helped an elderly lady in trouble. Over time, the ladies started gossiping about the rumors around Viscountess Oberon, who finally announced her divorce to her husband. The main story was that the woman was making money on her own, but the ladies suspected she was just having an affair with another man. In society, it's way easier to hurt others than Edel thought. Suddenly, Marchioness Celestine slammed down her cup with a loud sound and a tone full of displeasure. Crossing her arms over her chest, Barbara said that gossip nowadays is way more malicious than back in her day, and asked why the desire to stand out and get recognition deserved criticism. She didn't get what was wrong with ambitions like that. Edel couldn't believe someone could really live like that, and that it wasn't a mistake. Countess Radric exclaimed, "This can't be compared to how men handle things outside the home," but the Marchioness replied that Mrs. Oberon is a woman who took on the outside affairs that her husband couldn't handle. Everyone has to fight for their rights, not drag others down. Countess Radric's friends smirked, guessing the Marchioness sees herself in Mrs. Overton. Most of those present shared the hostess's opinion. Only Edel agreed with the Marchioness. After that noisy tea, the protagonist caught up with the Marchioness and asked if she could have a little time. Edel admitted her mistake in daring to pity her. Since she didn't know the Marchioness was stronger than everyone there, she wanted to be like her, so she asked to visit sometimes. Barbara really liked hearing that, since she also wanted to keep their friendship going. So without realizing it, they became besties. The Marchioness probably cared for her more than anyone else in the world. If the protagonist had heard her words a lot, could have been different. Now Barbara was yelling that Edel needed to break free from the men's manipulations trying to control her, but if the protagonist hadn't obeyed her father's orders, death would have been waiting. The Marchioness suggested asking for help and promised she'd do everything. It was their last meeting. Edel's heart felt so heavy with pain and sadness. It was like a weight of memories crushing her. She whispered an apology to Barbara. Mrs. Bogian asked if it was true the Count had called Edel himself. Mina nodded and said it happened during the day in the hall, but the former Duchess left quickly. So nothing serious. But the butler thought none of this was a coincidence. Even Celia defended the girl. The butler decided they couldn't let Adel, Celia, Layla, and Daisy rise any higher. Those shameless girls needed to be taught a lesson. Suddenly, Mina remembered some servants complaining about how hard it was to wash with cold water. Rumors popped up. But she denied them all since hot water was a privilege only for her and Mrs. Boyan. Anyway, all the money was quickly recovered by selling the Count's possessions. But the butler ordered everyone to shut up. It would be bad if the lady found out. But Mina was sure she just didn't care about that stuff. Boyan smirked with disdain because it was the truth. Mrs. Linnea only trusts her and the Count, who's rarely home. This house was basically under the main butler's control now. Just had to wait a bit longer. Edel handed the letter to the manager. Celia didn't get when this endless laundry drama would end since they were forced to do all kinds of pointless tasks. Looks like the manager was unhappy again and definitely whispered something in Mrs. Linnea's ear. The laundry supervisor turned out to be right. Mrs. Boyan proposed an idea to the lady who approved it. Since her residence had to run flawlessly after that cleaning, Daisy's whole body ached. There was mad work to do. Since the manager kept complaining non-stop, the main heroine was shocked to realize she'd been here over a month, but hadn't seen a single guest, not even once. Apparently it was because of the bad rumors about Count Adel. At first she thought badly of him too, but judging by his usual kindness and behavior, that dude didn't seem like the bad guy everyone made him out to be. Daisy figured even without guests, they had plenty of work thanks to Lady Lion, the youngest maid, who explained she now dealt with the Count's sister. When Lady Lion was in a bad mood, it got real tough because she always stuck her nose in the servants' business. Word was the Count made good money since he was young, so neither he nor his brother ever went hungry. Daisy didn't get why Lady Lion was so chill if her older bro was busting his ass for a noble title. Edel was surprised, thinking that with the Count and Lady Lion it was like they swapped roles. For the first time he learned how to wash clothes in this mansion, something he'd never done before. It was his first taste of high society life. The protagonist guessed they probably just didn't know how to act like real nobles. Seems like the Count showed zero interest in county affairs. All the power was in the manager's hands. Lots of maids quit because of her, but they blamed Lady Lion for everything. Since the Count gave them good references, she seemed scary but was actually a kind person. Edel realized the Crisis family had tons of problems. As long as Emperor Marcus Tuberino's authority stayed strong, Count Laszlo Crisis had to stick to his rank, so the Count urgently needed a good helper ASAP, like he could get married anytime. Anyway, whoever became Count Crisis's wife, the protagonist, hoped that woman would forgive her. The next day, Lady Lena called Edel to her presence. The young lady was curious about what that former duchess looked like, but Lion didn't look much like her older brother. The protagonist calmly reported that now she was just Adele since the Lancaster house no longer existed, but Lion snapped a little, saying she already knew. Edel thought about the lady's age and guessed she was around 20. Suddenly, she asked the protagonist how she could have married the 60-year-old Duke of Lancaster. Unfortunately, Edel couldn't choose who she became a wife to. The lady got mad, but a slight smile appeared on the protagonist's face. Without hiding her bluntness, Lady Lion straight up asked how the protagonist could share a bed with an old man. Turns out the Duke had a mistress, so Edel didn't share his bed. Lin was shocked to find out that mistress handled the Duke's money for the uprising, but she was probably dead now. The Count's sister didn't get what Edel's role was in that house. At that moment, our protagonist desperately wanted to prove her worth. If she handled things skillfully and did her job well, she'd definitely level up. But Edel was just filling a gap to make the family look perfect. The protagonist mentally called her past self dumb and smiled slightly, but Lady Lion didn't get it. Did the blonde also look down on her? According to Lion, Edel was basically a slave now and couldn't pretend to be a respectable Count's daughter anymore. But the protagonist didn't understand why Lion suddenly got mad. Lion was pissed because the maid dared to look down on her. She ordered Edel to kneel immediately. Lion couldn't believe how a common servant dared to look down on her lady. Edel apologized instantly and knelt. She only stayed standing, 'cause no one told her to sit, but the Count's sister didn't expect such submission from the ex-duchess. So she asked if Edel had no pride. Edel remembered she wasn't a duchess anymore, how insanely valuable noble dignity was. Maybe the blonde despised her too, according to the line. Now Edel was basically a slave and couldn't pretend to be a respectable Count's daughter anymore. But the protagonist didn't get why she suddenly got mad. The Lion was outraged because the servant dared to look down on her. She ordered Edel to kneel immediately. The Lion couldn't believe how a common servant dared to look down on her lady. Edel instantly apologized and knelt. She'd been standing simply because no one told her to sit, but the Count's sister didn't expect such submission from the ex-duchess. So she asked if Edel had no pride. Edel remembered she wasn't a duchess anymore, how insanely valuable noble dignity was. Now the Lion's law was the protagonist's mistress, so her knees didn't hold much value here. Edel thought about what true dignity and honor really meant. But then the Lion suddenly asked how a common servant dared to challenge her. The young lady's voice cracked into a scream. She knew perfectly well that all nobles just wanted to mock others. Edel realized she was projecting all nobles onto herself. The Count's sister ordered the woman to leave her room immediately. That girl was at the center of the madness the main character had luckily left behind. The Lion could have stayed free and kind, but for some reason that girl reminded Edel of someone. She remembered her little sister, and the moment the girl cried, convinced she couldn't take it anymore. Viral Manhwa Edel tried to comfort her, but the sister pulled her hand away. The protagonist didn't expect that at all. According to Lin, the older sister could handle it because she was a completely different person. And she had already suffered enough. Now her life was worthless. Adele's little sister was no longer by her side. Lin Canyon left, leaving the protagonist alone. The family story. Canyon wasn't too remarkable and started with the great-grandfather who gained land and discovered sapphires there. Drunk overnight, he handed over a considerable sum to the palace. The imperial palace, struggling financially, granted him the title of count. As a thank you, they were rich but had no honor or dignity. One day Dustin Canyon ordered his youngest daughter to name the 4 main families, but the 10-year-old girl messed up. Then it was 12-year-old Edel's turn, who answered correctly. These 4 families were so powerful that even the imperial palace considered them equals. The count coldly ordered that they never forget this. It was necessary so no one looked down on their lineage. Dustin Canyon exclaimed they had to marry into one of these lineages. As they left the hallway, Lin asked her sister if she could ever be like her. The girl thought she was too dumb. Edel shouted that wasn't true, but Lin remembered all the words their father had said just moments before. The blonde explained that their dad always spoke harshly but only wanted the best. Edel took her little sister's hand and suggested they not talk about it now and instead go eat some delicious cookies. And then study together. Lin smiled and agreed with her sister. She loved doing absolutely everything with Adele. However, the butler ordered them back to the room since from that day on, Miss Lin was forbidden from eating sweets. All of this was an order from Count Canyon. The protagonist didn't understand how it could be like that, but the butler just asked coldly if Miss Lin had finished her homework for the day. The girl answered confused that she hadn't. Lin ran off saying one last time to her older sister that she could eat sweets while she did the homework. The father was already strict, but now he was cruel. For some reason, he only acted like this with his daughters. But little Edel couldn't do anything or influence the situation, so her soul ached and anger consumed her. She wanted to grow up fast, at least for Lin, but it wasn't clear if everything would really get fixed after the marriage. Maybe becoming a flawless lady, and if she kept trying an elegant bride. Edel had to be the best bride in the empire. She just had to be fragile and smile beautifully. Then Edel could give her father the power he'd dreamed of since she was born. Even though she was already 16, Lin's father kept yelling that with so much intelligence, she'd never get married. Her sister, on the other hand, had already debuted in high society for a while and was everywhere. The count wanted Lin to finally be useful. The protagonist wondered if her sister would be happy with her gift. The white dove slowly and gracefully spread its wings, preparing to fly like a white angel about to soar into the sky. Lin, with bitter tears in her eyes, told her sister she couldn't take it anymore and just wanted to fly like a bird, and she did. The count coldly informed Edel that Lin had died. The young woman froze. Her heart stopped from shock and terror. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Edel repeated the question and the count responded by asking if she'd gotten just as dumb. It turned out Lin fell from the 3rd-floor balcony while looking outside. That's why Dustin Canyon ordered no one to be told. The family left, leaving Edel alone. The count was furious about the new problem that hit them. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor, constantly asking Lin why she'd done it. Edel remembered every time her sister said it was hard for her. Lin cried non-stop, not knowing how much more the protagonist, who had started to regain hope, had to endure. After meeting Barbara, she sank back into despair and eventually actually got married. Edel also considered that exit Lin had chosen, but the protagonist had someone, so she held on as best as she could. How could everything be fine for someone forced to live an unwanted life while their true desires were crushed? Edel could help Mrs. Linnea but didn't know if she had the right to step in. Now she closed her eyes, her heart heavy. But above all, the protagonist was now mad at her own helplessness. In the afternoon, Count Croesus returned to the manor. He noticed not even the housekeeper came out to greet him, even though that manor was only good for mercenary meetings. Linnea was glad to see her brother back. She knew today had been rough for Laszlo. The young lady asked what he had done at the palace today, and the count replied by asking why she cared. Linnea said there was no special reason. Laszlo didn't get why his sister followed him to the room. The man guessed she had something to say, but Linnea said it wasn't anything special. The girl said she'd been invited to a tea party hosted by Viscountess Emerson. Laszlo told her if she didn't want to go, she didn't have to, but Linnea saw it as a great chance to wear a dress. She was just a bit confused, since she didn't know what to talk about there, so she asked her brother to find her a good governess. Laszlo asked his sister if she promised to study hard and not throw tantrums, but the girl asked when she ever started being spoiled. However, the count demanded a straight answer. He'd already found so many governesses for her, but none of those women lasted 2 weeks in this mansion. Nothing was as expected. They were the first to laugh at Linnea. These women pretended to be so polite but called her the real dummy behind her back. Linnea held it together at receptions, but at the manor she could scream all she wanted. The problem wasn't the young lady, but the spoiled teachers. But the girl suddenly remembered the old duchess treated her a bit differently. The count's eyes widened as he realized it was Adele, even though she had higher status. This woman showed no pride ordering her to kneel. Linnea invited her just for fun. But she was so noble. Laszlo started yelling at his sister, asking if she understood the shameful act she'd committed. After all, they always looked down on those who use power to humiliate others. Linnea knew that perfectly but didn't get why she couldn't do the same. Aristocrats always looked at her with disdain, so the girl wanted to do the same, seeing nothing wrong with it. But the count explained she hadn't insulted an aristocrat, but mocked a servant. That was what you'd call cowardice. But Linnea thought her brother just didn't get it. She didn't even tell him. The insults she endured to avoid making him sad even though it was hard. So with bitterness in her voice, she called him way too uptight. Linnea hurried toward the exit, saying at the end she didn't want to know anything about him anymore. The door slammed shut and Laszlo was left confused and conflicted after the talk with his sister. He didn't know what to do either. He didn't even understand what he was doing. All because of the title the Serpent Emperor gave him. He said Laszlo had to be an example for all mercenaries, and at first he didn't even get what that meant. Mercenaries needed hope for a bright future. It was necessary. Authority to protect not just the Calliope unit but everything important. That's why the Emperor had reasons to give Laszlo such a high title and hoped he'd accept his fate someday. But at that moment, the hero didn't even know what to do with his sister. He thought about hiring another governess from the guards, but he had to warn Linnea clearly this would be the last time, though the Count decided to buy her a fancy dress and necklace. He was also curious how Edel was doing. He wondered if she was crying alone now. Laszlo started thinking about going to apologize for his little sister and how badly she treated her. But he quickly changed his mind when he realized he was thinking way too much about that woman. Laszlo immediately opened the terrace doors. His face flushed slightly, but now the young guy's mind cleared up since a visit right then would spark unwanted rumors. The violet-eyed man took a drag after Victoria's banquet. The nobility was restless. All because the Duke of Lancaster's house fell so easily. They seemed stronger than the imperial family. But it all fell because of that dirty monster Lazarus Crisis. Who could have imagined the imperial family would swallow their pride and reach out to that filthy mercenary? DeMarco Tuberin also came back from the battlefield. The men suggested switching out the emperor, since if DeMarco stays on the throne they'll fall into decay. But it wasn't time yet. If the big three families act openly, they'll catch them and accuse them of treason. Marquis Tulane got curious about that family that suddenly got rich. It was the Canyon County, and Duke Barrington remembered the Count's daughter had been handed over to that arrogant mercenary. Crisis Marcus Bimler with a sly grin said the Count was that kind of guy because of connections and sold his own daughter, so that insignificant person could lead them somewhere. The demanding voice of the father surrounded Adele from all sides. She opened her eyes wide and realized it had been a nightmare. Sometimes the main girl still thought about it just like the rest of her family members. She wondered if having a big fortune didn't bring them joy. If they wanted so badly to be nobles, they should have donated money to orphanages or hospitals for the poor. But now all that seemed pointless. The sunny morning turned into a chill start to another day. During breakfast, the main girl heard one of the maids getting scolded. The woman was saying no matter what, the girl had to get her work done on time and not slow her down, but Edel knew those two worked in different spots, yet the main girl figured that shouldn't matter to her. Noticing Edel had finished eating, the laundry manager suggested she go, and she agreed. The mansion was quieter than usual. Because the head maid had left with Mrs. Lynn and no one wanted to rush without the housekeeper, Celia suggested checking it out herself. Edel had been there 2 months, so it'd be good to inspect the mansion. That's why today she'd go pick up the laundry herself. The women themselves decided to handle what Edel hadn't finished yesterday. The main girl hesitated, but they reassured her. The women remembered Edel had a rough time yesterday during the chat with the young lady, so it was a little reward. In the end, the main girl agreed and promised to come back soon. Layla told Sally she was really good to Edel. It'd be tough dealing with all that dirty laundry alone, so whoever handled the washing decided to look out for her, but the main girl was interested in getting to know the mansion while the other maids could bail any time. But Edel wasn't gonna stay there as a war trophy. She left the laundry for the first time in a hectic hour. Inside the mansion, the cleaning was going strong. Edel understood Layla and Celia had given her a break on purpose, so she chose to finish up fast and go back to help them. Now the woman finally felt recognized. Suddenly Adele saw a maid she'd noticed before. The main girl didn't get why she wasn't at her work spot and was resting while the others worked hard. She wondered where the maids who should be there were. Adele knew a determined faction had formed around the head maid, but it wasn't right to leave the work to others. She wondered if the Count knew. It seemed Adele had no choice but to watch the mansion's problems. Suddenly from the next room she heard male voices. It was Count Crisis and someone else. The main girl decided to leave the room fast before the men caught her. However, the mercenary heard her. He slammed the door open and Edel froze in fear. The man had told the cook not to let anyone in. And suddenly a rat appeared, determined to eavesdrop on their conversation. The mercenary started demanding the woman identify herself. The Count immediately recognized the former Duchess and asked confused what she was doing there. Edel calmly replied she was a maid. The laundry workshop guy bent down and explained he was picking up clothes from Count Chris Sussex's room, and added he'd come back another time, but Laszlo said no need and just let him bounce. The blonde dude was shook by his captain's call, only then recognizing that face, realizing it was the actual Duchess of the Lancaster family. He was straight up stunned, but the guy skeptically asked if she even knew how to wash. Count Chris Sussex coldly asked his subordinate if he'd ever seen that woman's hands. They were hands of someone who grinds hard. It wasn't fair to judge by bias, plus Adel never got secret messages from his dad. Count Canyon the blonde was surprised the captain called him by name. Laszlo froze, realizing it, and suggested they get back to their convo, since they had to keep a close eye on the red mouse and wait for the yellow fox to show up. The Count said he had to head to the palace now. Even though there were no leads, the situation looked messy. Edel wasn't in a spot to say much, so he decided to do whatever he could. The captain approached Lord Milton and asked if he'd finished his training. The acting commander of the Imperial Knights Order, Edmund Milton, was just hitting the guard standards even though the Lancaster Duchy uprising was crushed. Nobody knew what forces might rise again. Edmund thought, "You always gotta be ready," one knight shared his take. If it weren't for Count Crisis, the deputy commander would already be the guard captain, but Edmund believed everyone had their place. Society valued the guard serving the king directly more, but both sides still worked together. The commander suggested not to overwork himself, but Edmund said he was just doing his duty. The emperor put meaning into every move, so you could figure the appointment of a simple Tona and an ex-thief was planned too, but Edmund didn't like the order's reaction. Laszlo decided to dress up to quickly hide the scars on his back, picked a black shirt, and started buttoning up carefully. Standing next to his workspace suddenly, he heard footsteps behind the door. Laszlo immediately asked who was there. Voices behind the door introduced themselves as Knights of the Order and said they came to meet the guard captain. Terry Bogarden, Angelo Balen, and Joseph Oz introduced themselves right away once the Count let them in. Laszlo asked what they needed, which seemed like a random request. The Count told them to stick to the point. So the three scared knights asked for the honor to train under his guidance. The request was really unexpected. The Count got curious why they came asking for that. The knights were even surprised by the guard commander's question since they wanted to be as strong as him, but palace training was the same for everyone, so it was easy to get lazy. That's why they decided to start training under someone strong who could objectively judge their skills. That's why they thought of Count Crisis. Laszlo was the youngest captain of the Imperial Guard, and known for his training methods. The knights were also curious to find out how the guard trained one of them. Learned the captain always left his doors open for ambitious knights. But it wasn't exactly like that. Laszlo never turned his back on anyone. It's just none of that elite ever sought the mercenary captain's advice. But these knights' bodies were worn down from bad posture. So Laszlo figured they wouldn't get far, but he had nothing against those wanting to improve the Count. Never imagined knights would say something like that. Laszlo praised their hype for training and told them he'd do it right now. Just one question. The Count was curious why they wanted to do it at his place. Training in the palace was awkward. Because of superiors being around, the knights thought it'd be kinda weird to train with the guard captain. While the commander was present, there was always some rivalry between the royal guard and the knights, so it wasn't smart to add more tension. Laszlo told them they could come next Saturday at 3. A cheerful smile appeared on their faces immediately. Teaching the basics wouldn't be the biggest problem for Count Crisis. Recap manhwa. He didn't know exactly how much his physical skills would improve, but the genuine desire to get stronger came with a high cost. The house manager announced that visitors would arrive over the weekend, so everyone had to clean their area carefully, but the maids weren't thrilled about this. Lady Boyan added that the laundry had to take down the winter curtains and prepare the clean spring ones, but the mansion had over 150 winter curtains that took forever to dry. However, the manager thought that wasn't her problem, plus the laundry was still dealing with dirty clothes, and now it was unclear if her staff could properly welcome the guests. Edith didn't get what suddenly happened with Count Crisis. A few days later, Laszlo decided not to go to the palace. The Count ordered them to head to Gracia Street, located in an exclusive district where majestic noble mansions stood. The administrator of Marquis Celestine's residence greeted Lord Crisis. The Marquis Celestine, dressed in his elegant outfit, immediately approached the Count and informed him they could finally meet. Laszlo thanked him for the invite, and right then Marquis Celestine's mother Barbara stepped up. With a warm smile, she suggested skipping the long titles and asked them to call her by her first name. Laszlo bowed and said his name. But Barbara knew he was the head of the family, so she decided to call him Count. Laszlo thought it'd be better to avoid awkward titles that might make things uncomfortable. Barbara accepted that decision as expected from a family head. Laszlo was a tough guy. In the end, our heroes ended up sitting at the table. Count Crisis wondered if it was even possible to host guests there with such a flawless butler and service, but he quickly concluded it was absolutely doable. The Marchioness took a sip of her tea and addressed the Count first, the woman with a slight worry on her face, and a voice full of genuine curiosity asked about Adel's health. How could a noble lady easily work as a maid? That was why Laszlo had accepted the invitation. A month had passed since Adel's reply, so Count Crisis assumed the meeting definitely had a specific goal. The Marquis decided to be honest with the Count even while watching the Emperor's moves. His mother Barbara wanted to meet Count Crisis personally. Laszlo had to understand why. In high society there were 3 factions. The imperialist faction aiming to strengthen the Emperor's power and the old aristocracy wanting to keep their influence. The last was the neutral faction, which hadn't joined either side. The Marquis decided to switch stances, not just for Miss Adele but also to get to know the Emperor and Count Crisis better. Laszlo wasn't even sure if he should be grateful for the attempt at dialogue. Barbara said she'd read Adel's letter that the Count had sent. Adel didn't want to bother anyone, but it was obviously super tough for her. Working at the dry cleaners, that's why the Celestine house couldn't leave innocent Adel in that situation. As long as social rumors didn't die down, she'd stay a maid. However, the Marchioness wanted to know what would happen next, and Laszlo honestly said he was still thinking about it, so he asked what Barbara was willing to do for Adele. Confusion showed on the woman's face. Count Crisis kept a serious look, waiting for his friend's answer, the ex-duchess who now worked in his house. Barbara was ready to do whatever it took. Laszlo smiled and said they'd get along even though love doesn't have an age. Barbara jokingly told the Count to find a woman his own age. The Count was surprised, thinking Edel could live here happy and peaceful. Laszlo was sure that'd be the case. The next day at the crisis mansion, young Lady Lion looked at the man fearfully and told him the count had been urgently called by the emperor, so she would have to serve tea to the guests and show them the house. Lion didn't get how that was even possible. Gentlemen would arrive at the house today, but her brother wouldn't be there. Yet the young lady had never organized a tea gathering before, and at such an important moment Laszlo wasn't there and she didn't know what to do. Linya tried to imitate what she had seen before, but wasn't sure if she was doing it right. She feared they'd make fun of her again. But the housekeeper smiled and told the young lady not to worry, saying everything would turn out fine if at least there was someone Linya could trust. She suddenly ordered Ada Lancaster to be brought immediately. This woman clearly knew more about tea receptions than anyone. Edel quickly arrived at the young lady's room, who, visibly anxious, asked her to come in right away. The housekeeper suggested the lady have Edel handle serving and organizing everything. They could show the guests how the former duchess serves, which would be a pretty impressive show. Even though the housekeeper was in the room, Linya called Edel, but now Boyan would be able to watch the duchess's struggles. Linya knew laundry work wasn't the easiest, so today Edel would serve alongside her. Soon 3 knights from the Imperial Guard would arrive, and the brother was running late, so they'd be the ones to receive them, but Linya wasn't sure if she should greet the guests at the entrance. The butler usually handled that, but since he wasn't there, the head maid had to receive the guests and take them to the sitting room. Lady Bojan reluctantly admitted she understood things well. Linya asked if she should wait in the sitting room since the knights had no titles. And since the lady now acted as head of the household, it would be appropriate to come down after their arrival. The count's sister ordered Adele to serve the appetizers at the right moment. When the guests arrived, Linya was glad when the ex-duchess said she'd head straight to the kitchen. That meant Adele would organize everything with elegance on her own. The protagonist stepped into the hallway and immediately grabbed her head. She felt sick for a moment but had to hold on until they brought the guests back. Linya looked at the clock and noticed it was almost time. She had to figure it out. Being the head of the household, sister Adele entered the room and informed the lady that the guests had arrived. The girl decided to go greet them, but the maid suggested doing something first. Adele asked for a handkerchief and some powder. Linya quickly found it and handed it to the blonde, so she could act immediately. The count's sister didn't understand what the girl was doing since she'd already put on makeup in the morning. And everything looked fine in the mirror today for the guests, and Masha had made a special effort. However, the former duchess decided to add something else. When everything was ready, Linya looked in the mirror with surprise. Now she looked way more modest than before, so she ordered Edel to apply more flower powder. However, that kind of powder wasn't suitable for a young single lady. Young ladies only needed to show their natural color. The protagonist tried to explain that creating an artificial blush with such cosmetics would spark rumors. People would start thinking the young lady wanted to seduce men. Linya froze upon hearing that. Now she understood why everyone looked at her weirdly everywhere for applying that flower powder every day. And Masha had said it was fashionable in high society, but Edel grabbed her by the shoulders and tried to calm her down, saying everything was fine. It was just that Linya shouldn't do it anymore. And the count's younger sister looked at the former Duchess of Lancaster differently. Now it was time to receive the guests. Linya had to fulfill the head of household's duties. A slight fear showed on the young lady's face, but she had no intention of backing down and suggested Edel accompany her. They stopped in front of a big door. Edel asked them not to worry since aristocrats always followed those with higher rank. At that moment, the person with the highest rank was precisely Linya. The young lady didn't understand why Edel said that since she had treated her badly last time. The blonde was just a maid like Masha, who was always nearby. Edel advised the lady to look at the knights from a superior position, showing that she was the one in charge there. The woman's words calmed Linya. Now she was ready to receive her guests. That very morning in the office of the first emperor of Marco Tuberin was wondering why so many of those who had organized the riot were now falling on him begging for mercy. He ordered Count Talon to handle it. All these men were begging for mercy, mentioning the late emperor no ruler ever received as much love and support from the nobility as DeMarco's father did. And people clearly missed those times, but that emperor was an incompetent ruler. He ignored the corruption of the nobility and only cared about his own pleasures after his death. DeMarco swore he wouldn't become the same kind of emperor, and vowed to pull this country out of its corrupt swamp, planning to restore justice in the nation. Rebels shouldn't get pardons just because they were nobles. The empire has laws, and many even supported tougher sentences, which definitely made DeMarco happy. The lack of trained staff was obvious. And not even Count Croesus, who visited Marcus Celestine's residence, informed the emperor. Few knew the extent of the bond between Barbara and Edel. The emperor asked how his meeting with Laszlo went. According to the informant, the invitation came from the Marchioness, and possibly the count wanted to test the stance of the neutral faction. 2 months had passed. Since Edel became a servant, it was too soon to fall in love, but not enough to forget him either. The emperor wanted to know how the lord would justify his silence and if he'd mention Edel's precarious situation. Lady Linya Croesus confidently entered the living room with a mischievous smile and asked the knights how long they'd been waiting for her, then introduced herself and thanked the men for coming all the way to her estate. The knights immediately started praising Lady Linya's beauty. She explained her brother was delayed by an unexpected call from the emperor. The young lady quickly suggested they sit down, and they all thanked her in unison. Still blushing at her presence, words flowed effortlessly from Linya's lips. The door opened and Edel entered the room. The young lady explained she had specially prepared tea and cookies, hoping the knights would like everything. Linya was happy with the first tea party at the manor. She watched surprised as Adel served the tea. The girl couldn't believe that was the whole banquet. Linya had introduced the guests differently and started to worry about their reaction, but all eyes were on Adele. The main character finished her job and headed for the exit. Unexpectedly, a knight said he wanted to wash his hands before eating, suggesting he wanted to leave. Linya was about to call a servant, but he refused. The knight thought it wasn't worth calling someone from afar, since they could just ask that maid. Another knight along with his companion offered to go out. Linya wondered if it wasn't rude to just leave the hostess like that. She hoped the knights weren't mocking her on purpose and silently prayed Adele would come back soon. The main character asked the men to follow her. Angelo Boleyn and Joseph quickly caught up. They didn't expect to get such a close look at the beautiful ex-Duchess of Lancaster. Now Adele understood why they asked her to guide them. She pushed the knight away from her. The main character pointed to the gentleman's bathroom and added she'd take them back to Lady Linya afterward. The servant's noble behavior offended the knights. They told her she had to accompany them all the way to the door. Joseph touched the girl's face and said a simple servant couldn't disobey an imperial knight's orders, but no one was allowed to treat Edel like that. She explained the Imperial Night Guard is the most respected order in Empress Bispera's realm, however. Now the knights, after visiting the chief's residence, started harassing the servant, currently acting like total jerks. Edel asked the knights to give their names, wanting to know which families these men belonged to, because their manners left a lot to be desired. Harassing the servant in the captain's house was blatant disrespect. Edel hoped that would be enough. Angelo Balin and Joseph got mad at the words of a simple servant who clearly didn't understand their situation, but Edel was one of those people who wouldn't keep quiet about something like that. The blonde was exactly the servant who wouldn't get fired from this house, so she would definitely report everything to the Count. Edel ordered them to stop immediately, or they'd be fired. Meanwhile, the vibe in the room was mad tense, and Line was straight up praying Edel would bounce back soon. Joseph snatched the maid's hand hard. He snapped, asking how she dared talk like that. He gave her a shot, but apparently words were straight up useless. Edel started struggling, but Joseph ordered Angelo not just to follow her, but to finally shut her up for good. The main girl looked scared when he told her to stay calm. Time froze when the knight raised his sword, but then out of nowhere a knife zipped past him and stuck in the wall, leaving a chill breeze behind. The knights froze instantly. Count Crisis was heading their way. Laszlo clenched his teeth, fuming. He asked if that's why she was so eager to train on his turf. Joseph immediately let go of the maid. The main girl stood up and greeted the Count. Laszlo's eyes burned with rage. The knights quickly started making excuses. They claimed the woman seduced them first and even asked to be taken out of there. The Count asked Edel if it was true. The knights swore they weren't lying, and then the captain of the guard decided to chop off their heads. They needed to be punished for lying. Laszlo heard those filthy words from the start. They echoed through his massive mansion hallway. He drew his sword and coldly stared down the knights. They dropped to their knees, begging for mercy. They said it was their first time seeing such a beautiful woman and they just lost their minds. The Count asked Adele what she wanted to do with them. The main girl didn't expect him to ask her opinion, but said they should follow military law. Even though Laszlo didn't remember all the details, Edel explained that besides being kicked out of the order, they deserved lashes and had to pay compensation. There was a case where the Imperial Order captain cut off his subordinate knight's right hand. Suddenly the knight shouted that Lord Edmund Milton would explain everything. Even though they sought protection from the second-in-command, Laszlo decided to spare their lives. In the end, they captured the men. Only then did Count Croesus ask the maid why she ended up in that part of the palace. The main girl mumbled something in response. Laszlo's eyes widened when he noticed her condition. The Count froze for a moment. When Edel let go of her legs and passed out right in front of him, he ran to her, screaming her name. Rumors about the incident at the Crisis Mansion spread instantly among all the servants. Now the housekeeper stood in the middle of the hallway while Count Crisis scolded her in front of the other maids. Laszlo couldn't understand how she managed the mansion at all. The Count asked Imashi if she had talked about that woman's status. The administrator replied that he himself called her a prisoner. The man coldly responded that Edel was a gift from the emperor. The administrator tried to justify herself, saying all the orders came from Lady Line. The housekeeper's main duty was to watch over the actions of the Count's younger sister. If Edel didn't recover, Laszlo promised the administrator that the Imperial Order would take her away. Everyone involved had to keep quiet. Imashi couldn't wrap her head around what was so special about this. Edel Lancaster that made her a prisoner sent by the Emperor. It didn't change anything. But now the whole palace was in chaos because of her. The Imperial Order's deputy commander arrived at the residence. He immediately greeted Count Croesus, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. Edmund Milton sincerely regretted meeting Count Croesus under such unpleasant circumstances. Laszlo suggested skipping the formalities and getting straight to the point. The deputy commander reported that under military law, harassing a maid meant severe punishment. The knights were sure the Lord would save them right now, but Milton added that the request wasn't inappropriate, so the decision was to expel them from the order. Laszlo smirked when the knights started yelling that it was unfair. Laszlo smirked sarcastically as the knights started yelling it was unfair. Edmund Milton told the villains to be grateful it ended with just expulsion, since the commander was shocked. The ex-knights began begging for mercy at least once. She was just a common servant. Suddenly, Edmund Milton decided to talk about the suffering maiden who'd once been a duchess. He felt like apologizing to her on behalf of the order. Laszlo's face turned serious hearing that request. The deputy commander reported he had no bad intentions, and the least he could do was apologize. However, Joseph yelled that all this happened because of Edmund Milton's fault. He himself suggested the 3 knights ask Captain Crisis to take them for training. The vice chief personally said they could see that woman at the manor, otherwise the knights wouldn't have come here. They couldn't believe they'd been used. They started insisting on their immediate rescue. With a sly smile, Edmund commented that the captain might misunderstand everything now. He suggested they go learn from the Viscount. The vice-captain did this because the knights kept bringing up Viscount Crisis. Edmund proposed calling those who had overheard the conversation, as Laszlo suspected. Edmund was baiting those idiots, but without proof he couldn't say anything. That's why the count told the lieutenant to step back, promising to pass on the apologies to that maid. Edmund asked with a smile if he needed anything else, but Laszlo said no and wished the lieutenant caution on his way back. Turning around, Edmund headed toward the carriage. His face twisted instantly with rage. He couldn't believe that idiot dared act so arrogant toward him when the captain's spot should have been his. Edmund was a noble who knew the meaning of honor, but some useless, dirty mercenary had snatched his position. The emperor had been way too generous giving that title to an idiot. Plus, Laszlo had taken a war trophy. Edmund Milton didn't think it deserved his attention, but now he was deeply interested. The protagonist slowly opened her eyes. She didn't immediately understand where she was. Celia, sitting next to her, nervously immediately moved closer to Edel when she saw the young woman had woken up. The protagonist asked right away how she got there. Celia replied they'd talk about that later since she'd almost died. Then she told Adele that before. Daisy had taken care of her, but now she'd come in her place. The Count had already sent for a doctor. And Adel found it strange. It'd be better if the servants weren't treated but just given hot water. Suddenly the laundry manager apologized to the protagonist, surprising Adele. Celia thought she shouldn't have overheard all those ridiculous orders from the housekeeper. Then everything would have gone fine, not even when Lady Lane called Adele. Did she get involved? Celia believed dealing with guests was better than handling dirty laundry. But the protagonist reminded her she'd already stepped in for her many times, for which she was deeply grateful. But Celia did it just to annoy Mrs. Bo-young. Many maids came and went, but one of the main reasons was always the head housekeeper. Edel, on the other hand, had to endure everything to survive. Celia really wanted to help her and improve their relationship, but always thought Edel wasn't any different from the rest. The girl tried to convince herself that the former duchess could adapt, but the protagonist clarified she couldn't, since only there had she found such wonderful friends. Edel was convinced she'd only managed to hold on because of them. Celia took the protagonist's hands, thanked Edel for those words. The girl suggested they keep looking out for each other, which made a happy smile appear on the protagonist's face. Shortly after, Daisy and Layla joined them. This time the meal shared with friends tasted delicious. If happiness had a flavor, it'd definitely be as sweet as the piece of fruit Edel held in her hands. The girls kept chatting for a long time. 3 days passed at Chris's manor. The head maid had her salary cut for 2 weeks. For neglecting the mess in the manor, Lady Line was put under house arrest. Daisy wished her friend to stay strong and come back soon. Before entering the Count Croesus's office, the protagonist took a deep breath to shake off her nerves. Then she opened the door. Laszlo turned around at the sound and looked closely at the protagonist. And for a moment he kept watching her without saying a word. Silence fell in the room. Adele didn't get why the Count was so quiet. Laszlo was pissed off because those 2 dumbasses hadn't been punished. The Count's anger made total sense, since they had insulted him all because of a simple servant. That's why Adele apologized for her behavior. In the world there were plenty of nobles who suffered scandals with their servants, but Laszlo asked confused, like what the hell was she even talking about? The guy didn't get what she could have done, so the blame fell on the head housekeeper and Linny for not doing their direct duties. Adele remembered Lady Linny was still young and had no other choice. She was way too green to handle guests. It was her first time, and in such a weird situation anyone in Linny's shoes would be freaking out with fear and anxiety. Since Lady Linny wasn't a countess yet, Laszlo found it hard to believe he was actually defending her. Recap manhwa. The main girl said she hoped the Count would cut the young, inexperienced lady some slack. She didn't want him to lose his sister, like she once did. Laszlo agreed with Adele's words because if he'd thought straight, nothing would have happened and no one would have had to get punished. The main girl remembered the mistake was those knights, not the Count's. The guy told her to sit down and said Adele would be working in the kitchen from now on, since the laundry wasn't a good spot for her. Adele got bummed hearing she wouldn't work with Celia and Layla anymore. Laszlo noticed she wasn't happy. The woman asked if there'd be any other punishment, which caught the Count off guard and left him frozen for a sec. The blonde asked nervously if it wasn't usual in noble families that even if a servant wasn't guilty, they'd still get punished to protect the family rep. Laszlo stood up fast and asked if she thought he was dumb. Now the Count got why those dumbasses were so cocky. They thought they wouldn't get punished. Laszlo could barely hold back his rage and reminded Adele he was a merc, so he didn't get those noble customs, so she could just move on and not stress about it. At first the Count seemed kinda harsh, but despite his look the guy was probably way more sensible than other nobles Adele knew. The main girl decided to ask the Count if other servants could use hot water. Laszlo asked confused if they really washed clothes in cold water with this freezing cold. Adele felt that and added it applied to showers too. She was shocked he knew that. The woman asked surprised if he hadn't ordered to ban firewood for heating. Turns out Laszlo had ordered to buy everything needed because he didn't want servants forced to use cold water in the middle of winter. Although he never said outright they could use hot water, not even clarifying it with the maid, the Count realized he was the worst head of the family ever and promised starting tomorrow he'd order everyone to use hot water. With a happy smile he thanked Adele. The servant looked surprised, but a smile also appeared on her face, because she wasn't scared anymore and on the contrary now found him charming. As promised, Laszlo ordered the laundry and bathroom fixed so there'd be enough firewood until summer. The servants were hyped hearing about the hot water coming. The main girl was happy seeing their smiles. Suddenly the door slammed open, and the head housekeeper angrily asked who was just standing around doing nothing. According to Bo-hyun, Edel was talking about her own comfort without realizing others were suffering because of her. Thanks to her, 2 women ended up in a tough spot. Edel got a promotion just because the Count noticed her. But they weren't gonna argue with Adele over something so dumb. Plus, thanks to her, they could use hot water. The housekeeper froze hearing that. She found out the Count had recently been to the laundry and was shocked they washed clothes in cold water, even in the middle of winter. The housekeeper asked everyone to wait until she talked to the Count herself. Everyone assumed the housekeeper liked cold showers, but she said maybe there was a misunderstanding. However, Adel had just heard it all straight from the Count. Now they could just be happy, the housekeeper said. She was furious thinking Adel had deliberately told the Count to weaken her authority. The butler yelled that if Adel messed up the veggies she wouldn't forgive her. The main character told the head chef she couldn't wait to work with him. The butler was sure Adel had just lost her mind. The blonde suspected the mansion owner and his servants had probably been under the control of one person this whole time. But Adel was the only one they wouldn't fire because she could report everything if needed. Right then Lin was sitting in her room, sure Adel was now disappointed in her too. Since all she had to do was call the servants like she predicted the lady would never be a real noble, Lin was sure everything was lost now. The protagonist was called by the kitchen manager. At that moment Adel, focused with a slight smile, was carefully peeling potatoes, taking off the skin. Lola scolded her for not cleaning the cauldron yesterday. She started to protest when the protagonist reminded her it wasn't her responsibility. Adele, with a genuine smile, added that cheating wasn't necessary. And the best thing was to honestly fulfill her duties. She asked Lola not to forget that today. Edith had no intention of staying the servant, who put up with everything. A little later, the protagonist sighed in relief after finally finishing her task and decided to rest a bit before prepping dinner. Working in the kitchen was just as exhausting as laundry. Edel was starting to think meeting Celia and Layla in the laundry was her biggest luck, but she had to keep grinding for her friends. The blonde didn't notice when she fell asleep, and only woke up hearing voices outside the door. Mrs. Bo-hyun happily asked Bobex why he was shaking so much. After all, it wasn't the first time, so there was no reason to worry. The man explained the current vibe was unbearable. The woman said she'd find another supplier if that was the case. However, Bobex promised to handle everything, and the head maid praised him, saying with her around, he'd always have the upper hand. The protagonist concluded they were skimming money. The merchant hesitated to sign the documents, but the main butler's overconfident behavior made her suspect they were really stealing the manor's cash. Adele decided this time she'd find solid proof. She heard the butler's footsteps going up to the second floor. The head butler probably just left the receipt in Count Chris's office and left right after. Laszlo was at work, so the office was empty. That's why the protagonist sneaked in quietly and silently apologized to the Count, even though this intrusion was necessary to catch the bad guys red-handed. Edith quickly found the warehouse receipt. It said all the veggies delivered were top quality. But that wasn't true. They took advantage of the manor, not knowing the varieties. Edith wondered where the ledger book was. People like that always keep records. Because they're so obsessed with money, they don't want to lose a single cent. Surely they weren't just scamming with the products. Suddenly a female voice asked who was there. Young Miss Lin was surprised to see Edel in the hallway. The protagonist froze like she was frozen, not knowing how to react to Lin's sudden appearance. She started thinking frantically about what to do. She had to say something right away. The protagonist calmly greeted the lady, but Lin ran up to her and asked what she was doing there. Edith decided to say only the absolute minimum now. She replied she was worried about her. The protagonist heard that Count Christus punished her for that incident and feared for her condition. The situation was desperate. She was sure Edith was scared too. The protagonist clearly remembered the young lady's shaky hands before facing the knights. Lin said everything was fine. She knew Adele had asked her brother to reduce the house arrest. The line replied everything was fine. She knew Adele had asked her brother to reduce the house arrest. The protagonist responded confused. She only asked and accepted, but no one had ever risked something like that. But the line had more to say. Adele was surprised when she suddenly thanked her. The young lady's face flushed instantly, because she was really embarrassed to say those words, but they were super necessary. To change the subject, Lady Line suddenly asked if Edel knew Viscountess Emerson. Edel felt it, and the lady commented she'd gotten a second invite to her reception. The surprise hit the protagonist's face. Angela hyped Camilla up for the dope decor in the hall. But the woman asked to hold up a sec for the juicy part. She told her she'd invited Mrs. Line. Chris's Camilla's thrice-removed aunt said the party was going to be even more lit. Mrs. Line asked the protagonist hopefully if she could be friends with Viscountess Emerson. Mrs. Line really needed at least one real homie. Adele totally got where she was coming from. She suggested waiting for the third meetup since usually by the second or first, people just start vibing. Line was hyped she'd checked in with Edel and got shook, thinking they'd already met 3 times. She was dying to know what the old Duchess of Lincolnster thought. About her, though, she didn't dare ask. Adele told the lady that real friendship takes time and genuine effort. But when you find your soulmate, you just know. Lynn was curious if she'd get that. Then she said goodbye. The next day, before young Mrs. Christus hopped in the carriage, the maids wished her luck. The carriage rolled out of the estate. Since neither the lady nor the housekeeper were around, the maids decided to chill. They were sure when she got back, she'd throw a full-on tantrum, so better not to step outside at all. Eden was curious if Line looked good today. After the last snack, she at least learned how to do her makeup right, but the blonde was worried. She hadn't seen the dress. The protagonist was low-key praying everything would go smooth. Near nightfall, the cart came back. The head maid ran into the house yelling mad loud for someone to get out of the hallway ASAP. Mina bolted out with the other girls. Line threw a vase and asked who left it there. It was already March. But they still hadn't taken down the winter decorations, which could make folks think some sus stuff. The lady ordered them to find the gardener right away. Meanwhile, the other maids were picking up the pieces. In the end, young Mrs. just vented her rage on the servants. After they compared her to others, it took some guts to clean the lady's room. The protagonist raised her hand as she walked in. Adel instantly spotted the legit disaster Line had made in her room. But she wasn't fazed. She cleaned everything carefully. Suddenly, Lane said they needed her to come back tomorrow too. The protagonist stopped sweeping when she heard that and realized the chat about tomorrow needed her full focus. These people always mocked and ignored Line, even if not straight up to her face. The young girl was starting to realize maybe she was the reason for all this, which is why they treated her like that. Lane hated herself for not being able to clap back. She figured Adele probably found her gross too. The protagonist stepped up right then to the young lady, put a hand on her shoulder and called her by name all sweet. Adele was sure it had been tough for her. Line nodded and immediately started crying. The lady didn't want to wash her face or go to bed because tomorrow they'd come back, and she'd have to go to that awful party again. But if she didn't, rumors would spread. The girl didn't get why she had to go through this. The protagonist got curious about Mrs. Chris's, why she kept accepting all the invites. Even though Line felt humiliated, they told her if she said no, her brother would get roasted. But Alina got roasted even when she went, which crushed her deep. The lady was lost on what to do. Adele said the first step was to fix her rep, which was easy. And Adele promised to explain everything ASAP if the lady took a hot bath first so they could plan. And Adele promised to explain everything right away. If the lady took a hot bath first, then they'd discuss the plan. Angela and Camilla analyzed Linnea Christus's ridiculous behavior. They invited her to the reception, just to quickly make her understand she didn't belong to the high world. But Angela thought Count Christus wouldn't let that happen. Still, Camilla was sure the fool would shine even tomorrow. Right now, Linnea was taking a warm bath with rose petals that Adele had specially prepared for her for Viscountess Emerson. That girl was just entertainment. Adele's first advice to her was to fake like everything was chill. Take a deep breath and step in. The girl was sure today would be better than yesterday. She was hyped. She managed to sit down smoothly at her spot in the reception. She had to focus only on herself and never show that the day's event was messing with her. The young lady had to act a little more indifferent to the side eyes. She thought about grabbing some tea right then. The musicians started playing while the aristocratic ladies kicked off the dance with their partners. The girl felt like everyone was throwing shade at her, but kept telling herself she could handle it. Now that she was sipping slowly, she realized how fire the tea was, so she savored every second. Even though she felt disapproving stares near nightfall, 2 ladies approached the young lady with smiles on their faces. They told her the dress looked amazing, highlighting her flawless taste and style. She wasn't expecting it and thanked the compliment right away. According to the ladies, even the necklace was a marvelous pick. They suggested that Lady Croesus get closer to the one who helped her with today's outfit, and they hinted they should bounce together from the reception right then. Viscountess Emerson came up to Mrs. Licio and Mrs. Brungen and asked if they enjoyed everything at the reception. The ladies said they liked everything but were about to leave. Mrs. Emerson invited the aristocrats to stay a bit longer, but they declined, so the Viscountess asked the same to Lady Croesus, and she said she was also thinking of heading out since it was late. The lady asked if she didn't like the reception, but the young one said she found it super entertaining since yesterday the ladies weren't expecting that from the young miss and even Viscountess. Emerson was caught off guard by those words. The ladies praised Lady Croesus for putting Camilla Emerson in her place. They suggested from now on to always give the same clear answer, but honestly, Lady Croesus said it without even thinking. The noble ladies said goodbye, hoping to meet again soon. Lady Croesus's heart started racing early. Edel asked who picked the dress and pearl necklace. Lady Croesus said she chose them herself, and the protagonist praised her, saying she looked super elegant. If the lady wears it with pride, she'll outshine everyone. The lady had never heard anything like that, and Masha always told her she was too young and clueless about fashion, so high society would look down on her. But the maid was dead wrong. Lady Croesus had way better taste and knew how to flex her best features. The protagonist suggested the young lady check her reflection in the mirror, and Lady Croesus was shook seeing herself. Trusting Edel was the right call. Our heroine was surprised. When at night she was called to the Count's office, the head of the house apologized to Edel for the late call and said that starting tomorrow, she'd be the personal maid of his sister. Edel didn't even know how to react to that news, but there was no one else suitable in that house. Count Crisis apologized again for calling her so late to his office. But Lin Lesio demanded it. She smiled when Edel said it was no problem and warned her sister that if she caused trouble again, she wouldn't forgive her. Edel saw the happiest smile ever on Lin Crisis's face. He used the nickname for his little sister, and the protagonist's heart started pounding. Now Lin Crisis would grow up in that mansion, loved and free. Edel clasped her hands to her chest and silently begged her sister Lin Canyon to let her take care of Lady Lin. This time she wouldn't regret it anymore, these clumsy but genuinely caring siblings surely had each other's backs since childhood, like Adele and Lin, even though the protagonist had older siblings. They never spoke, they were like strangers to each other. Maybe that's exactly why. Because after the wedding they would split up anyway and the siblings wouldn't even be part of the same family. They even scolded her when she didn't want to get married. Now that Lin wasn't around to marry, Eden had little time left to accept the marriage with Lancaster. The Count of Christus told the protagonist that her room would now be next to Delinia's. It was already night, so the lady promised to show it to her the next day. Laszlo placed his hand on his little sister's head and stared straight at Edel, saying he didn't want to force her. The protagonist understood that this mansion was now her new home. Recap manhwa, she replied she'd do everything she could, and the young lady instantly took her hand, hyped that she finally accepted. Now that woman was just Edel, neither Lancaster nor Canyon. The servants didn't expect Lady Delinia to change so much. It was all thanks to the right makeup, and now the young lady seemed kinder than usual, something the housekeeper totally hated. It seemed like Edel had a positive influence on the lady. Even the Count admitted that Delinia was completely different now. The man also noticed Edel looked way better than before and told her straight up with a warm smile on his face. The protagonist didn't expect to hear that. Laszlo was sure it'd be easier now to talk to Barbara. Edel called the Count and he immediately blushed. The man quickly switched topics and suggested to the young lady they pick up their conversation from yesterday. He decided to set up a couch and table there because they had nowhere to sit at the moment. After helping his sister, the Count decided to thank her personally. The protagonist said she didn't do it for a reward, but that the promotion was thanks enough. However, Laszlo knew dealing with his sister wasn't easy, so he asked her to at least accept this. Compared to what Edel did, this was nothing. The night before Ninja barged into his office, begging him to give Edel what she left behind, leaving the man confused. The girl explained she was the one who dressed her. Laszlo froze when she told him that for the first time she wasn't embarrassed. Now the man understood why she'd always been like that. Count Christus believed that being so honest and cheerful since childhood, she'd adapt without problems to the unknown aristocratic world. He left her alone, fully trusting that maybe they'd never get close again, so Edel became his savior. The Count wasn't sure if the gift he picked would please the ex-duchess, so he asked her to accept a check. Edith replied with a hint of sadness that she didn't need it. Laszlo was surprised by that answer. After all, at least she could buy new clothes and some nice jewelry. He reminded her she couldn't leave the mansion. Graf asked, confused, how she couldn't leave. He was speechless, realizing Edel always considered herself a prisoner and servant in this house. But that wasn't true. Laszlo had said from the start he saw her as a servant. Edel should get the same salary as the other servants, and the Count had already started thinking that wasn't happening, but Edel said she was paid, and then Laszlo said then she had no reason to lock herself up in this mansion. The protagonist still couldn't believe it. Her face flushed hard and her heart started racing. Laszlo always thought Edel was tough, but she had a soft side, and Lin's help was proof of that. But actually, at first the protagonist struggled to hint at Lin's problems. She didn't know how to calm her racing heart. Edel made up her mind and told him she'd rather not take money. The protagonist begged them to believe her, assuring her words were sincere. Laszlo instantly said he trusted her and urgently asked what she wanted. But it wasn't anything else but a favor. It wasn't necessary right now, she just wanted the Count Christus to always trust her words, and the man agreed. Lin happily showed Eden the invitation to another reception. The protagonist sincerely wished her the best congratulations. The young lady announced the next room was ready, and Edel could move her stuff and start working the next day. Lin went back to her room humming a tune, but before closing, the housekeeper's hand stopped the door from shutting. The young lady spun around sharply and asked scared, "Who's there?" And Masha walked into the room, guessing today would be rough for the lady without her since she was supposed to take care of her. The maid pulled out some new floral powder, but Linya snatched it away and yelled she didn't need it. The young lady asked Irada, the maid, if she thought she was dumb for letting her go just like that, and Masha shouted that the powder was recommended by maids from other houses, but Linya didn't want to hear it and ordered the maid to leave her room. The head maid stormed into the hallway, clutching her apron in anger. "'Cause it was all that damn Edel's fault, but this wasn't over and Masha wasn't gonna let it slide." Daisy said with tears in her eyes that now even her little sister was leaving her so far away, and she missed her bad. You'd think Edel disappeared for good, but the blonde was actually happy to see Daisy so sad. The main girl admitted she felt kinda weird living alone in such a nice room, but her friend said that's how it had to be since even Mina always had a nice room even though she never had a title. The house manager assigned rooms based on preferences. Edel decided to use this as a test since Daisy was curious about how Edel planned to decorate the room, cause now it's trendy to hang small portraits on the walls. They said the artist's street was super popular. Actually, Edel never really thought about it. The main girl suggested they hit that street together next week. And also grab something delicious, of course. Daisy didn't object. Adele was happy and wished every moment could be like this. But one day, Lady Linnea couldn't find the pearl hairpin she wanted to wear that day. The blonde figured it might be in the black box, but it wasn't there, and Linnea started thinking she'd put it somewhere else. The main girl said she'd check the other boxes, and the young lady suggested doing it together. When they started looking, they found the boxes had a lot of empty spaces. Linnea was sure the other chains and the gold necklace were still in there. If only the hairpin had disappeared, it could be blamed on carelessness, but now it was straight-up theft. The young lady ordered everyone to be gathered immediately. Linnea and Adel went down to the first floor. The house manager reported that she had gathered all the servants by the lady's order, since everyone should help find the criminal, and Masha pointed out 3 maids who cleaned the lady's room on a rotating basis. Besides them, Masha and Adel were also there. Linnea ordered all those maids' rooms to be searched, but the house manager said they'd also check other rooms just in case. According to Masha's logic, the accessories could be hidden in the rooms of their friends. Adel told the lady it was unlikely they'd find anything in the ninja maid's rooms. She figured the accessories were probably sold, although at that moment she was considering other possibilities. For justice, everything had to be cleared up. Adel was happy with the lady's good intuition. Sometimes she was too temperamental, but with the right education she could improve. The house manager ran into the hallway and happily announced they'd found the culprit. The maids immediately started whispering. The main girl was speechless when the head butler pointed a finger and claimed she was the guilty one, along with her maids. The jewels were found in the rooms of Daisy, Celia, and Layla. The girls were horrified by the accusation. The maids exclaimed it was a mistake since they didn't even know what the young lady's room looked like. The girls dropped to their knees and declared it a clear lie. Linnea immediately realized it was really weird. The house manager remembered those 3 were close to Adel, and the common maids didn't have enough money. So it was a legit motive. So Adel stole the jewels and gave them to her friends, and Masha shouted that there was no other way it could have gone down. The house manager was about to step out for a moment so everyone could get back to work. There was no other way it could have gone down. The administrator was about to step out for a moment so everyone could get back to work, including Celia, Daisy, and Layla. The administrator didn't understand where they were going when they returned to her room. Adel asked the lady if she believed in her guilt. Of course, the administrator didn't buy it, but she was curious about how Adel had managed to stay calm in such a tough spot. Maybe that composure was the mark of a true lady, but Adel didn't know the right answer. The main character explained that at that moment she didn't feel, but thought that finally the time had come. However, Eden needed clear proof of her innocence. Still, the main character fully trusted her own strength and promised Lady Linnea she could prove it, redeeming the young lady's trust in her. The Count found out that while he wasn't at the palace, an incident had happened. Adel decided to spill everything she knew. Laszlo gave her the green light to do so. The main character wondered if the Count remembered how she begged him to trust her instead of empty promises. Of course, Laszlo remembered and believed in her innocence. But it wasn't about theft, and of course Adel hadn't stolen anything. The real problem was in the contents of the documents the main character drafted based on what she'd seen and heard. They needed to verify details with the Count's books. Adel requested an official investigation in the name of Count Kritsos and the Kritsos line. Laszlo asked Adel if this had to do with the head maid accusing her of theft. The main character nodded and added that because of her, Amasha could no longer manipulate Lady Line or control the servants like before. Daisy, Celia, and Layla suffered because Amasha wanted to get rid of anyone connected to Adele. They were given the heaviest chores, since they couldn't pay the fees. Adel was waiting for this moment, knowing how the Lokritas were. Surely they'd noticed weird stuff around, and Adel hoped their testimonies would back up her suspicions, but she wasn't sure if he'd believe her. Laszlo smiled and said it was all his fault. The main heroine asked, surprised, if he really bought her weak arguments. But the Count remembered he himself promised to believe her. He felt Adele wouldn't say dumb stuff or belong to those chasing material gain. This woman was someone valuable who opened his eyes to Laszlo. However, the man asked for something in return. With a smile, he asked the Duchess of Lincoln if she was ready for the consequences ahead. Finally, they arrested the accountant and the merchant. The woman kept screaming she was innocent. Count Kritsos coldly ordered the former head maid to immediately explain what and how she had embezzled, but Imasha screamed she was innocent. Although, according to records found by Nathan, Imasha bought cheap products and passed them off as top quality. Plus, she hiked prices on expensive stuff and profited by buying the ladies' cosmetics and dresses. According to the fake accounting books, the total stolen adds up to about 250,000 Linton, and Masha yelled it was hard to manage the estate she'd worked so hard for 3 years, so they could just look the other way. The Count offered her 2 options, go to jail or sign a document for 400 coins. And Masha was speechless because the stolen amount was way less, but the rest was compensation and payment for her life. Now the former manager had to choose. Daisy excitedly asked Celia's sister if this meant all the false accusations had been dropped. The girl nodded and said there was no reason to worry anymore. However, another problem popped up. Now the head housekeeper position was vacant and they had to decide who'd fill it. Next, Linnea couldn't understand how they'd lived with such a housekeeper. Laszlo agreed with his sister, then pointed out that, for example, the one who revealed all of Imasha's crimes could take the position. From now on, Adele would be the head housekeeper. Lady Line couldn't hold back a satisfied smile. The main character's friends got hyped, hearing the awesome news, and were genuinely happy for Adele. Laszlo immediately asked if anyone had objections. After the storm, an almost overwhelming silence took over the estate. The guilty fled in a hurry, and the innocent took their places. It turned out Imasha housed the poor maids in awful rooms, even though she knew there were plenty of good empty ones in the mansion. The friends decided to help Edel once they finished moving. They had to reorganize duties and hire new people. Who knows what would have happened if it had been someone else instead of Adele. Even though the place was a total mess right now, just knowing Masha was finally gone made everything feel better. The main girl cracked the door when she heard a familiar knock. Count Croesus apologized for showing up so late. Adele was so shocked to see Laszlo that for a moment she forgot everything she wanted to say and just stared at him stunned. The guy apologized and asked to come in after deciding to fire the head maid and Masha for several days. The Count's mercenaries searched the related companies and found hidden double-entry ledgers. Turns out Yasha hadn't been keeping any of the books right, so now Adele had to start managing the house from scratch. But in that mansion without a butler, she had no clue how far she could go. There was a knock at the door. Edel thought it was her friends. It was wild how many people were visiting her now, and if Eden had told her this 3 years ago, she wouldn't have believed it for a second. It was the Count of Croesus right away. He stammered, hyped up, trying to make sure she didn't think anything weird, but Edel wasn't even thinking that. She let him in. She apologized to the Count for not even having anything to offer him to eat at the moment. The man calmed her down and said thanks to her the estate had become way more lively. Invitations kept coming in non-stop. Adel smiled warmly and said it was all thanks to the young lady's cheerful and energetic nature. Laszlo replied she'd always been like that, but he just hadn't understood it, everything he hadn't been able to give his younger sister. In the last 3 years, Eden managed to fix in just a few months. Finally, the peace they'd been waiting for had arrived. No matter how much she thanked him, it would never be enough, the man told Adele. He wanted to keep asking for her help, not as Count of Croesus, but on a personal level. Being born as a brother to a sister like her wasn't a choice of fate, even if Adel hated and despised him. He asked her to take care of his sister, but Adel told the Count she didn't see it the way he did, more like Recap Manhwa. He himself didn't want a trophy like that, and it would have been better if the Count had gotten a work of art or a jewel. Still, Laszlo said the Emperor had given him the most valuable person, Eden. She looked at him surprised, thanked the Count for those words, then murmured that no one believed the wife of a traitor would dare to survive. If the Count hadn't accepted Adele as a servant, she probably wouldn't be alive now. The man knew it was super hard for Adele, but if she kept living, sooner or later, good days would come. So she shouldn't be thinking about death anymore. Adele agreed, tears starting to stream down her face. She'd always been told to control her emotions and hide her true feelings, showing weakness wasn't allowed. But now she cried without trying to hide it and said she just wanted to live a completely normal life. Laszlo pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and she took it right away. He didn't judge her for showing weakness in front of him, knowing being normal was probably super tough for her. He wondered what else could happen if Adele showed her tears again to someone who'd already seen her weak. But the fabric he handed her gave off warm comfort. Adele really wanted to live a normal life. A family, love and friendship, just the usual stuff, had always been her hardest, most unreachable dream. She decided to wash the cloth and return it tomorrow without fail. In the end, Adele slept through the night without dreams. In the morning she had to get up and eat, because from today on she'd have tons of tasks thanks to her new role as house manager. She redistributed chores based on the maid's preferences. Until new servants arrived, it would be tough, but she hoped everyone would work hard and with fresh energy. The young lady also wanted to say something. The lady confessed she'd been super nervous about the responsibility all this time, even when Masha was messing with them. Ninja apologized to the maids for causing so much trouble. Now her main goal was to run Castle Crisis without any shame. Bad for causing them so much trouble. Now her main goal was to run the Crisis Castle without any shame. With Adele's help, they could finally grind hard. Later, the young lady apologized to Adele's friends for not clearing up the false accusations against them sooner, but the girls were just happy to be able to stay in this castle. The servants thanked the lady for the new rooms. Ninja laughed out loud, because she was happy and super hopeful for everyone working now in her home. The Crisis House was starting fresh. After so much tense time, the promised day off by Daisy finally arrived. So much had happened in those days, and finally they could rest, and Adele was happy to have kept her promise. They went out to the street, where even aristocrats strolled. Daisy asked her sister if she wanted to go anywhere, and the main character said she had seen a clothing store and thought she needed to buy everyday clothes. Daisy smiled and suggested going there first. The main character froze. As soon as she heard her name from passers-by, Adele stopped and noticed a dark-haired aristocrat looking at her surprised. At that moment, it was Lady Lucille Arden. The aristocrat immediately called her friends to introduce them to Adele. Daisy started to worry, but the main character explained everything was fine and they just had to say hi and leave. Suddenly, a man asked if a criminal could even be on the street. Adele wore a beautiful dress, and they started thinking she had stolen it. If the ex-duchess had even a shred of shame, she'd already be buried with the other traitors. Many in Adel's place would have preferred a dignified death. The main character calmly replied that Count Croesus had given her permission to go out, so she asked them to leave her alone. These people were no different from Imashi. They just wanted to cause pain and see others cry, so the important thing was not to fall for their provocations. Adele bowed and wished them a nice walk. However, the men said disdainfully it was obvious she was that mercenary's mistress, which is why she acted so confident. It was to be expected since she started calling that pleb Count. Adele wondered if she should just take those insults. Count Trixie suddenly appeared and said he didn't even know he had a mistress nearby. The aristocrats instantly shut up. Surprised by the unexpected appearance of the captain of the guard, Edel didn't understand why Count Cripsis was here now. Not only did Edel and Daisy come to this street, but the Count and his sister also decided to visit the street food area. Since Laszlo became a noble, he ate way too refined food, but this street food actually suited him better. Lena suddenly asked if it was true they became orphans 16 years ago. Laszlo was surprised by the question, but the young woman explained she was curious how a kid could take care of another kid. He replied they survived however they could, but Lena insisted not to dodge the answer. He didn't remember well the house where they lived as kids. The faces of their parents, of course, had long disappeared from his memory. Lena had already moved quite far away. That's why she wanted to know more about her childhood shared with her older brother. It turned out they used to live in a cozy, happy home. But that everyday life collapsed in an instant. Laszlo ran full speed through the forest carrying his little sister on his back, who was crying and calling for their parents. The boy promised he'd protect her no matter what. They could come for the kids any time. So they had to keep running while he still had strength, but his hands could no longer hold Lena's weight. If they found a safe place where they could stay together, everything would be way easier. One dawn, a bright glare suddenly blinded Laszlo. The grandmother who had given them a meat pie days before found them and asked if they'd been hiding there for several days. A kind woman offered to go with her, maybe because of the days they'd spent on the run. But Laszlo instinctively sensed he could trust her. The grandmother explained she lived with her husband and would love to take care of someone. Laszlo did it looking for a safe future alongside Lena. Now neither the name nor the past mattered, so the kids could build their new world. Safe and full of joy, when someone appeared to take care of Lena, Laszlo started going out to earn a living. And little by little, he dedicated himself to swordsmanship. Those elders cared for people lovingly, and at their home the kids were truly happy. Lena remembered the grandfather and grandmother well. She guessed her brother didn't remember their parents either, and the man replied that even though he was little, they had a really nice house, but Line didn't remember her parents' faces. She'd never forget Grandma's meatloaf taste, though. Still, Line was starting to like her current place too, so she suggested they go check it out. On the other side of the bridge, as they walked the whole way, the heroes ran into their lady companion. At that moment, she was getting roasted in front of everyone, and the brother and sister's faces instantly showed pure rage. They couldn't believe someone would say that about Adele. The aristocrats were sure a woman who agreed to marry an old dude was super sketchy. Laszlo couldn't take it anymore. He snapped and asked, pissed, "Who the hell do you think you are?" At that moment, 4 jerks were spreading nasty rumors about stuff they had zero clue about. The guys said the captain of the guard couldn't just threaten people, but Laszlo thought he was acting pretty chill for a regular dude. He said Adele was a key member of the Count's family and demanded an immediate apology for the slander against her. Laszlo asked Adele if she remembered the names of all the haters. The ladies and gents quickly apologized to the Count and promised it wouldn't happen again. The captain didn't want to make things messy, but wasn't sure how Adele would react, so the aristocrats bowed to the main girl and apologized. Adele's eyebrows furrowed, but she still accepted the ladies and their escorts' apologies. They hurried off, and the young lady was seriously pissed about the noble's behavior. Who even dares to slander Adele? Suddenly, Daisy ran into her dad. Adele told Line they came to get a portrait with Daisy, and suddenly they saw some familiar faces. Line also wanted a portrait with her brother, explaining he spent all his time at war, and you never knew when he might die. Suddenly, the young lady didn't want to forget the people she cared about again. That worry was totally natural. But the young man now understood just how tense Line got every time he left. Even though Laszlo thought he was a failure, he shared something with Adele. The hardest part was living a normal life. Daisy was shocked to find out that Adele had already agreed to go with someone. She didn't catch the start of the convo since she was far away. The artist greeted the guests. Usually an aristocratic portrait takes over a month, but the Count heard they paint fast here with pastels. The commoners started making portraits copying the aristocrats. The main girl guessed the nobles now wanted quick, cheap portraits. Of course it was good they decided to get a portrait painted, but Lean thought the big bro's picture was off because he needed to shave and fix his hair. Adele told Daisy she'd pay for the portrait herself. An artist approached the brother and sister and asked if they'd let him guide them to the ladies. A student pretty skilled would take care of them, so no worries. Daisy was doing this for the first time, so she was nervous. Adele suggested they just imagine they were chilling together. The main girl had only painted her own portrait once in her life, right after marrying the Duke of Lincolnster. But that one had burned down a long time ago, so this would be Adele's only portrait. After a while, everything was ready. The young artist was blown away by Adele's beauty and suggested she become an actress, but she shot down the idea. The guy kept pushing, though. He said with that look all the tickets would sell out just from her presence. Laszlo tapped the artist's shoulder and coldly asked him to paint another portrait. The Count wanted his coachman Marco to paint a portrait with his daughter. Suddenly, Laszlo told the host to paint another portrait where Adele would appear alone. The main girl was shocked by the request. The man explained to Adele that Duchess Celestine often asked about her, so he decided to send the portrait. The blonde thanked the man for caring so much about her. Adele never even dreamed of meeting Barbara. She thought she was already pretty happy with her life. The man told Adele that Duchess Celestine often asked about her, so he decided to send the portrait. The blonde thanked the man for taking such good care of her. Adele never even dreamed of meeting Barbara. She thought she was already pretty happy with her life. But turns out you can still expect the best. Today was a really good day. The Count suggested the girls ride back together in the carriage. But they declined, saying they wanted to buy some more stuff. The Crisis family wished them a good time on their free day. Adel suggested they keep exploring the shops. Laszlo was hyped to draw a line art portrait and make a worthy gift for his loyal frame. He even managed to make a portrait of Adel. He had to send it to Duchess Celestine to show that his girl was doing well. But Laszlo wasn't feeling it at all, so he decided to put it on hold for now, justifying his choice, saying it'd be weird to send something like that without a heads up. After a weekend packed with events, new servants handpicked by Nathan arrived. Since Adel became the manager, they needed to find a personal maid, and she pitched it to her girls. But they said no, so between the new and existing servants, the main girl picked 2 solid candidates. Then she found another suitable person. Adel suggested sorting stuff into what to toss and what could be sold. Daisy asked if she could handle it. The main girl told her not to stress, promising she'd help and explain everything. Daisy, eyes shining, promised she'd give it a shot. Since the young lady would meet different people, Daisy's kindness would help shape her character. So far, Daisy had only talked with folks way older than her. The main girl hoped they'd influence each other positively despite the status gap. Edith reported that after lunch a tailor would come by, as the manager announced. Soon after, a seamstress from the Danamis house arrived. Line wanted to order 3 outfits, a dress for strolling, one for a picnic, and a nightdress. The woman suggested picking from the catalog and taking measurements right away. Line asked for advice from the manager and the seamstress. She only confirmed the rumors that Lady Crisis leans on her maid for everything, meaning any dress could be sold at a premium. Line liked one dress, but the seamstress suggested checking out another option, a new youthful dress design that's super popular with girls her age. Line doubted the woman's words. Adel realized the seamstress was trying to offload unsellable items. The woman proposed a white muslin dress, but Line slammed the catalog shut. Saying it wasn't needed, she decided to only order the dress she'd picked earlier. The seamstress asked, confused, if the lady wasn't ordering 3 dresses, but Line decided to do it later. The Count's sister asked if her taste was really that bad. The woman let out a forced laugh and suggested taking measurements. Now Line could handle it perfectly, quickly regaining lost confidence and keeping up with her studies. Adel decided to be there for all this. Line successfully completed her first sale. The young lady pointed to another item and asked the merchant to add it to the total. Line told Adele it was a gift for her. The main girl was surprised and asked the young lady if she hadn't bought it for herself. Line replied that only those who grind hard should use such things. The merchant was known as a rumor spreader, so sharing this now would boost Line's rep. The merchant saw the lady as careful and a good business partner. Adele didn't care about the rumors since she just wanted to get the gift. The main girl accepted it and thanked her lady. Line asked her to make good use of it. Now Adele had another precious item. The main girl's room was full of gifts and letters from dear friends. She decided to jot it down in her diary today. Last weekend, she and Daisy bought diaries at Galantery because besides daily entries, Adele wanted to make personal notes, wanting to record all those countless memories created in this mansion. Suddenly, Linnea burst into the room. My lady, she grabbed Adele's hand and said she had a favor. Totally out of nowhere, she asked the main girl to take care of her older brother, Count Crixus. Adele's eyes went wide with shock. This story happened the same day at noon in the Brunken mansion. Lady Linnea complimented her beautiful look again, and the young girl thanked her right away. Line also complimented Jeremiah Bruinen, who invited her for tea. Lady Crisis introduced herself to the Duchess Bruin's granddaughter. There were no unbearable people here. At other parties, some still looked at her suspiciously, but here everyone was chill. Suddenly, the lady asked why the Count didn't show up to the parties, and Line replied he was super busy. One of the young women admitted the Count seemed kinda intimidating and told Line not to get it twisted. Since it's his job to look imposing like a knight of his rank, the lady meant the Count seemed totally unapproachable. Miss Line, could you help your bro? It's about time he got hitched. They say the truth's obvious when there's no bad vibes in the words, and now Line got that the real problem wasn't her, most aristocrats. Recap manhwa judge. A person by their looks and connections, even Line couldn't handle her brother's stubbornness, so the young lady asked Adele to help her bro change so he could finally get married and have normal friends for once.